please do in chat and Peter, and I can direct Peter to them or work out some way. Otherwise, after Peter's presentation, then Catherine Venter from CSWEP is going to provide a brief response as a discussant to Peter's presentation, and then we'll have an open Q&A. When we get to that bit, I'll repeat how we will do that, but in the usual way, if you've got questions, you want to put them in the chat as you think about them, then I can keep a record of them for the end. And otherwise, we'll be doing it as well by putting your hands up, but I'll come back to that later. If there are any questions or anything, I will to introduce our speaker for today. We're really, really pleased. Thank you very much, Peter, for heading this way in this webinar all the way from Adelaide, where you should be settling down with a glass of wine or something. Peter Sandiford is a senior lecturer in organisational behaviour at the business school, the University of Adelaide in Australia. He's going to present today on blurring the contours of work life, leisure, volunteering and employment. And I think this is it's really fitting for CSWEP to be doing that. One, because there are so many of us that are involved in research that in some way connects to Peter's, myself included, but looking at the role of volunteers, the way they fit into a workforce, the way they are or are not workers, issues around emotionality, issues around precarity and the precarious nature of that work, and also using methods that many of us are familiar with in some form or another, ethnographic methods and participant observation, observant participation, and so on. I'm also intensely jealous that Peter managed. I mean, why didn't I think of this when I was doing my PhD? Like, rather than sitting in a lock factory, where looking at lock workers, you know, building keys and locks, what you should do is go somewhere where you want to spend most of your 3 years, i.e. a pub. And I think thinking about doing an ethnography of pubs is just absolutely inspired. But that kind of levity aside, I think they're just, at this time when we have so many parts of the public sector being cut and such a lot of emphasis being put on what volunteers do, it's not surprising that it's been an emerging area of interest for us within CSWEP, and we're really, really pleased to have you here today, Peter. So
thank you.
I'll hand over to you now and be quiet.
Okay, let's see if I can share. What I need to share. Good. Okay, well, is that working for everybody?
Yes, it is. That's working for me anyway. I can see it perfectly.
Okay. Right, well, thank you for inviting me and thank you for the introduction. It's a slightly unusual, for me, approach to a webinar or seminar, because as I found myself working on it, I found myself less focused on the data from my work and a bit more on the theory. I suppose I'm more familiar with the data. And so I'm proposing to focus a bit more on my own experience and interpretation application of some of these theories with a little bit of background on the studies. Certainly in the follow-up question answers and comments, I'm happy to data a little bit more. But I suppose, like most researchers, my work has evolved over a number of years and a string of research projects. I feel that I've been quite fortunate that a couple of those projects have been able to last for a while. In fact, the pub study I started a couple of years before I moved to Australia, and it's still on the back burner somewhat. As I get older, it does seem more challenging to sort of position myself in my work when I introduce myself, as the boundaries or the contours perhaps seem less obvious despite managerial tendencies to try to emphasize those boundaries. I find it very difficult to answer the question, what do I teach or research, when asked by someone that I've met for the first time, for example. So a little bit of background. Being a hospitality management undergraduate all those years ago, I followed a pretty rigid program of study, never actually studied sociology or anthropology or any of the real social sciences at uni. I only started to identify some interesting stuff when I was looking at my honours dissertation. And then I was a little bit more drawn towards anthropology. But over the years, I've gradually come across a variety of research and theories that have inspired me to greater or lesser extent and helped to guide the way that I think about my research as much as anything. And as a long-time fan of pubs, it seemed an obvious choice for my PhD and the follow-up research. Although spending weeks and months conducting participant observation in pubs is not necessarily as fun as it sounds. I soon became interested in how people use and relate to pubs and use them as social and economic space. And this seemed much more interesting than focusing on commercial organisations, brands, individuals, or activities. And I soon was drawn to this idea of place or space as a useful lens for making sense of all of these issues of humans living and working and socializing together. In fact, I think one of my early introductions to Bourdieu came from Hillier and Roxby's book, which you might be familiar with, complete with an introduction by Bourdieu in English himself, Habitus, the Sense of Place. And I found this related to so many of the ideas that I was looking at in the pub as place, the pub as a social environment, the pub as a workplace, and the pub as a place of leisure, that it seemed to make a really useful sort of silo spanning and unifying concept. I've tried to keep the structure of the webinar a little loose. I'm not sure how that'll actually work. I've not done one of these for a long time, but I'll start off by briefly introducing some of the key theoretical perspectives. I won't be able to give a lot of detail on these, but I'm trying to see how they fit together. It's at this stage of my research, it's trying to make sense of two studies, well, 2.5 studies almost, and lots of different theoretical ideas, some of which seem at times to be almost contradictory. So as I said, I won't overdo the empirical work. It's more focused on the theory and, of course, my interpretation and application of that theory. I hope I do it justice, and I hope that Bourdieu in particular wouldn't be too irritated with the way that I see his work. Perhaps a little bit, but hopefully not too much. The pictures I'm using come from the studies. I think they're sort of self-explanatory, but I can give a little bit of information if needed. So, a little bit of that theoretical background. One of the early ideas that struck me as being useful and important is Habermas's take on public space. I won't use the German, I'm not very good at pronouncing it. And this idea of the public space and public sphere soon became of interest to me when I was looking at how people interacted within pubs. And a little bit more about that later, I'm sure. But after a few years of messing around with this, when I was starting out my pub study, that's the 2012 pub study, I started to be drawn, as I suggested, to Bourdieu's work, and habitus in particular. Habitus of place was my introduction. I've read quite a few critiques of the two people's work, and I'm still not totally convinced of the idea that Habermas and Bourdieu's work is quite so different as a few scholars suggest. This idea that Habermas is the philosopher and Bourdieu the sociologist seems a bit simplistic to me. And the link might not be obvious to most, but it did help me to make sense of this use of public space, especially in the early part of the pub study, and the community role that so many people attached to pubs. I also found it fascinating how we perceive, make sense of, use and attach ourselves to institutions and places. And of course, the pub could be seen as a bit of both, and how that attachment is manifest. One thing that always springs to mind when I think about this is, I hope you have a bit of patience with me here, is Thomas Hardy's novel, The Mayor of Casterbridge, and the character Farfrae, a Scotsman, an expatriate Scotsman, who would sing emotionally with tears running from his eyes of his distant homeland, Scotland, with no intention or desire to actually return there. And this is often seen as a sort of affective or emotional attachment. And quite a lot of the literature, especially in hospitality, focused on this rather than on the behavior. And I thought that the idea of embodiment through habitus helps to make sense of this a little bit. It's not just what you say, but it's what you do. As I said, I like the idea of public space, a public space representing space outside of the state's control, going back to the original Habermas ideas, where individuals can exchange views and knowledge, something that to me seems so obviously linked to pubs, although Habermas himself on a few occasions protested that pubs were not an example of the public sphere, which is perhaps one point of disagreement that I might have. I'm sure we've all experienced different types of lawlessness within pubs in certain situations. And although these are often associated with alcohol and its disinhibition, pubs are often involved in important aspects of the informal economy, as well as the social role that they offer. This idea of self-empowerment, especially in historical times where many interest groups would meet in the pub with nowhere else to meet. Early trade unions and masons would certainly meet in pubs. And I believe that Birkbeck College of London Uni originated in a pub-based educational program for working men. So I think that there was plenty of examples of Habermas's public sphere. And although he was more interested in coffee shops, and some historians focus on the coffee shops as contributing to the outbreak of the French Revolution, the ability to serve wine, in my humble opinion, was likely to have been just as significant given its use as a symbol of French republicanism. So I do see pubs potentially still part of the public sphere in a number of ways, although not in ways that necessarily Habermas would support. I quite like the idea that my application of work would actually irritate him, as is probably the case with other thinkers. You might be familiar with the works, for example, of Ray Oldenburg, another person who influenced my ideas of place and space, the idea of the third place being a refuge from home and work. And this idea that spaces could be hijacked by people looking for an alternative to home and work as an escape, a convivial refuge, if you like, has a lot to do with how people are socialized into societal and cultural norms. The things that we learn in pubs that help us to exist in society at large. This is also where the final theory I've listed up here, Manolis's role partiality, it's my own words, but Manolis and colleagues took a postmodern view of different types of role that people inhabit in work organizations and as customers. So they suggested that customers tend to take on a role of partial employee, and employees tend to take on a role of partial consumer. And I would add to this the idea of being a partial volunteer. So we've got perhaps potentially crossed over roles to help us make sense of behavior that may seem mundane, habitual, and structured on the background and context of the place. So as an example, the staff in my PhD thesis, in my PhD study, would habitually use the pub where they worked as a place to socialize, not just as a place to drink, but as a place to do the same things that the customers were doing, engage with other people, engage with colleagues, engage with locals, and engage with strangers. So I quite like this idea of having these different roles that are not always easy to identify. So I'll briefly introduce the two studies. We could, if we're pushing a point, see the two studies as representing two fields for fieldwork, a sort of bit of double meaning there. The first one, this is the village where I conducted my pub study. Northam, all the names obviously fictitious, was the first social context, if you like, of the study of the today's topic. I'd say that the pub is more obviously relevant as an arena for this study, given the apparent regularity of at least some of the behaviours associated with pub use, at least traditionally. And this idea of habitus offers an additional model for exploring people's, that's the workers and the customers' relationships with each other, with the pub's place, and as a source of their identity, their individual identity, especially if you're looking in relation to regular or habitual types of patronage. The second context, that of volunteering, is developing more in my mind at the moment, and this really welcome your thoughts after the session, after the presentation. I'm asking, does the two angle or the two study angle offer an opportunity, or perhaps is it an unnecessary complication? When I started preparing for this presentation, it seemed to be very much an opportunity. Now I'm starting to wonder, is it an unnecessary complication? Would it be better to stick with the two studies separately? So, okay, Northam is a medium-sized village. As you can see, it's about 3,000 inhabitants. Within the village area, there are 5 pubs and a couple of private members clubs. This is a slightly anonymized map, but you can see roughly the position of the pubs that we were focusing on. The study was conducted by myself and a colleague. We did joint ethnography, which was a fascinating experience in itself. The fieldwork took place within a period of instability, certainly the second stage of fieldwork, which took place in 2016. I had a few months to visit and conduct some additional fieldwork. And the change from the first part of the study, all of the pubs were under new management or new ownership. And during the study, one of the pubs actually closed down temporarily. It turned out to be semi-permanent. And there was talk of one of the other pubs closing as well. So it was quite a period of upheaval, and that gave some additional insights into the behaviour of regular pub customers. The second study is based on a single organisation. I'm calling it Environmental Protection Volunteers, and this is a nationwide NGO that engages in conservation work. As with the pub study, the fieldwork here focused on one part of the volunteering experience. I conducted participant observation in some residential So I seem to be getting a message. I'm not sure if it is a problem or not. I'll carry on anyway. I was, after starting quite broadly, I gradually increased my focus on residential volunteer tourism rather than the more common one-day projects. So EPV conducts daily projects across the whole country based in different offices in different states, and they do run regular weekend, week and fortnightly projects which are in more remote areas with people signing up as tourists and volunteers to get a tourist experience and to do some volunteer work. So that became more of the focus of the study. And these projects include various different things, conservation work, removing invasive weeds, maintenance, tree planting, seed collection, and conservation research. Most of the projects I was involved with and observed were about conservation research or citizen science. The volunteerists come from different backgrounds, including students of relevant disciplines, environmental and conservation disciplines, and people just with an interest in conservation want to learn more about it, and students seeking experience for their CV or even to improve their spoken English. This is the park, situated a couple of 100 kilometers away from a state capital. And I thought, just for fun, just out of interest, I could include roughly to scale a map of Northam just to show the scale of it. Obviously Australians do things a bit bigger, and this is considered a relatively small park by Australian standards. You can see that a large part, about 2/3 of the park, is not open to the public. That's where a lot of the work will be done by the volunteers. And so an additional benefit, if you like, to signing up for a volunteer tourism trip to Lyme Park is you get to see parts of the park that the general public don't see. That's a brief introduction to the study. I thought at this stage I might provide a bit of a brief diversion from this particular study before I return to apply some theory. I hope you forgive a little bit of bias here, but as I suggested, talking about the North End pubs, pubs have undergone huge changes in recent years, and the change is continuing, and the change has probably been around for a lot longer than we'd like to think. I'd suggest that even this can give insight into these sociological ideas, habitus in particular, and does seem to reflect some of the changes in attitude and practice present in pubs, like those in my study. What am I talking about? Perhaps this could be symbolized by a pub-based illustration. I said, no. Oh, I'm sorry, I seem to have a bit of an issue with my... There you go. I got the slides in the wrong order. I do apologize for that. I said it was a bit of a stream of consciousness thing. I don't know if any of you actually recognize this, but this picture is of a famous football stadium, which was once squashed by rows of terraced housing, a sort of image that I think a lot of us are familiar with historically. The idea that the sport was very much seen, football that is, was very much seen as being a working class sport situated in the neighborhood of working class neighborhoods, working class residential housing. And of course, where you have the sport and the residential housing, you're likely to have a pub. In this particular instance, I labelled the pub the Albert. It is the real name of it as well. What am I showing you this picture for now? Is it about illustrating the position of pubs in the community? Is it about illustrating a bit of change? Because a very similar angle of that would show you this today. The Albert's still there. The stadium is still there, albeit a lot bigger. But a lot of the housing, in fact, much of the housing has disappeared. We can see quite a lot of areas where the housing has been pulled down. And indeed, the Albert, this working class residential sports-based pub, remains the only bastion of residential tradition, of working class tradition, protected by regulations and to a certain extent, in this case, tradition and popular demand. It could be seen as a symbol of permanence despite change. Yet the function of the pub itself is today increasingly symbolic rather than practical. Its regular neighbourhood customers have long since been replaced by a sort of pilgrimage-like clientele seeking to consume history and tradition rather than beer. And that fits in perhaps a little bit with the idea of partial consumption. It also fits in with this idea that habitus isn't about keeping the same tradition in the same way. It's not the same as practice remaining ingrained in the past. So I think it's quite a nice symbolic image of the role of the pub in the community, the changing nature of the community, and the idea that habitus can still apply to it. But can it still apply to it? That's perhaps the question that I need to be asking next. I'm going to have to backspace because obviously I made a few errors with the pictures. So that question, how can habitus relate to both of these very different studies? Once I started getting interested in Bourdieu, I found that a lot of scholarly analysis of habitual behaviour seems to encourage this reference to habitus, often seeming to perceive it as the same as habit, which would certainly annoy Bourdieu's work. I'd suggest that it can help us to understand the mundanely habitual behaviour at a theoretical level, but it needs to be framed around an understanding of socialisation into wider socio-economic influences. And this idea that really resonates with me from Bourdieu is the idea of the feel for the game. That's what originally intrigued me when looking at pubs, and later when I started thinking about the volunteering too. I think it links nicely with the idea of disposition rather than determinism. It is going to change. We are going to change. We're not going to be exactly the same as the people that had the most influence in our socialization. The formal rules for the game are less significant to us than this feel for the game, than this interpretation of what I can do, of what I can get away with, perhaps. So I'd say that these disposition, the formal and informal rules, remain really powerful in structuring the arenas that we live within and those dispositions. So habitus has been applied to lots of different social contexts, not least hospitality. quite a lot of research has been done using it, and I found that Lynch's idea of hospitality as welcome habitus was particularly useful in the pub-based situation. This idea of feeling welcome in a world of hostile potential seemed to be particularly relevant to this study. Such an idea goes well beyond commercial hospitality. It resonates with ideas of Derrida's hospitality and human social interaction. Arguably, it looks at how we engage with other people, whether close ties exist or not. And in a pub, we may have people we see every day. We may have the regular customers that we know well. We may have people that we only see once passing through. So how we engage with those is quite strongly a product of how we expect to be engaged with in our own pub and indeed in other pubs. When I was actually, I said I'm not going to talk much about my data, but when I was doing my first phase of the study, a lot of the customers would claim that their first job was often in pubs, and many told of informal socialization as underage customers, their first taste of beer, often illicitly and provided by an uncle perhaps, or a friendly barman. And stories like this told of a recognition that the pub as an institution, or perhaps as a field, was seen as a way to learn how to behave away from home and usually work. It was the first way of socializing away from the workplace, away from home and away from school for so many people. A way of making some extra pocket money as the first job. And this again reinforces Oldenburg's ideas of third place that I mentioned at the beginning. It takes them forward somewhat. It's suggesting that the pub provides early adolescent and early adulthood socialization opportunities outside these formal legal controls often, and representing a sort of struggle almost with licensing laws. And quite a few of the older members of the community would complain that this was becoming less and less possible due to tighter enforcement of those laws. In Much's study, a 2003 study of pub managers, he questions the emphasis on how habitus conditions practice, suggesting that structures that emerge from practice also require attention. So it's a way that people may be socialized into behaving within pubs, within society more generally, at work, but it also is not staying still, it's not static, as was shown perhaps by the football stadium example. Whichever your perspective of habitus, though, the concept has a clear relevance for any analysis of human attachment to these different places. And the pub, as a highly visible example, is a useful one to focus on, perhaps. Bit about volunteering. The volunteering part of this presentation is less formed, although I'm still shooting through the pub stuff as well. Found a few quite interesting articles that explore volunteering through a habitus lens. John Dean's work is quite useful here. He drew on habitus to make sense of different norms. He was suggesting in particular that families from poorer areas are less likely to see volunteering as a normal activity. In other words, it's simply not part of their habitus. their inherited concept of society. And he uses this idea when he's exploring governmental attempts to encourage volunteerism among young people, saying that it's pretty tricky to do if people aren't socialized into it, into the norms of volunteering from an early age. And you could see this as a more formal attempt by the government to try to stimulate volunteers, to encourage people to volunteer who would not normally do so. And this could relate to a sort of trend from the informal to formal in volunteer recruitment, going beyond class distinctions. Rochester et al., for example, explored how certain socio-cultural changes are impacting how volunteers engage with and are recruited. They suggest that weakening of traditional family ties, a sense of community declining based on neighboured location, secularisation, and professionalisation of voluntary sector organisations has undermined the institutions and networks through which many people found their ways into volunteering in the first place. It goes beyond simple class analysis here. And they identify what they call countervailing trends, such as longer periods spent in education, giving opportunities to recruit volunteers through educational institutions, through universities, and organizations through CSR programs, perhaps encouraging employees to volunteer, which both examples would be seen as potentially replacing some of the lost volunteers, but also it could be seen as an over-formalization of volunteering. So what impact will this have on the way that people perceive volunteering, on the way that habitus is reinforced, if it's not based around the informal, gradual, early life socialization? So perhaps this idea of greater formalization of volunteering opportunities has significant implications for how people go about it. Is it more likely to become a sort of instrumental, even career-based or CV-based activity, something to do for other reasons than perhaps more traditionally we would volunteer? So I think that there's some quite interesting ideas there that habitus could certainly contribute to. I'd be interested to see how Bourdieu would react to that sort of question. His view of habitus as a sort of combination of the subjective and the objective could be illuminating if we're looking at the way that people become introduced to this volunteering experience. How far is the subjective experience potentially subsumed in more formalized, rule-based, prescribed habits of institutionalized volunteering? I'm wondering how we're doing for time.
Hi, Peter. I'd say no more than 10 minutes.
No more than 10 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, I can quickly go through a couple more ideas then. So that key question that I was thinking about at the beginning is how far can I, or should I, try to look at the ideas of volunteering and pubs together rather than separately? I see them both fields, if we see them as fields or institutions, as tradition bound, structured, and structuring habitus, potentially. How far that remains the case as we become increasingly formalized, I'm not sure. If we think about them as educating individuals, educating young people into how to behave in pubs, for example, educating volunteers about how to engage with volunteering activities in a sort of subjective as well as objective sense by doing, by experiencing, by observing, by feeling the youngsters in those conservation behaviours, observing other people doing it firsthand. In pub behaviour, I'd suggest that both angles work quite well. We do learn the more objective rules, but we're certainly engaging in the subjective feel for the game. So I'd say that learning, applying, or perhaps questioning the game's rules is also a part of that process, seeing both places as potential public spheres, going back to Habermas, and potentially, as a lot of people talk about, particularly with volunteering and volunteerism, facilitating and encouraging a sort of civic agency. Both provide a relatively safe environment to meet people, with a publican and team leader there to oversee in a sort of gentle, not always gentle, policing role. In both fields, if both fields are seen as becoming more formal, with increasingly explicated behaviours, whether through regulation, licensing for pubs, prescribed procedures such as health and safety scripts, what are the implications for those participants? How far can a feel for the game continue to influence practice if external agencies seek to, or at least appear to seek to, homogenise these? There's also an issue, I think, in both of a sort of social paradoxes. Social paradoxes are particularly evident in pubs. A pub is a place for informality, but is commonly used for more formal occasions, celebrating a wedding, mourning after a funeral. There are places to meet and places to be alone. They often seem to lack rules of behaviour, rowdy Friday and Saturday night, perhaps, and even encourage the occasional individual, the occasional character, the regular customer, the bar worker or publican, to habitually break particular rules while policing otherwise complex behavioural codes. And this can, in my opinion, call to attention the nature of habitus itself, this collectively orchestrated idea, and make sense perhaps of the variety of acceptable behaviours and which ones are, and identify which ones are unacceptable and why. So habitus, as Secord suggests, allows for the mixture of freedom and constraint which characterizes social interaction. As with volunteer team leaders, the pub habitus is clearly structured by external expectations, but it becomes possible for the individual or the small group to contribute to the structuring within individual pubs or teams when volunteering. Perhaps this sort of level of freedom is particularly empowering, given the security of the welcome habitus, for example, of belonging. This was most obvious when it was lost. One of the pubs, as I mentioned, closed down during the second period of field work. A small number of regulars came into the other village centre pub. There were two village centre pubs, and they seemed exceptionally uncomfortable, very uncomfortable, out of place. This wasn't their normal arena. This wasn't their normal field, until one of our regular couples, a couple that would visit each of the pubs most days, entered the bar, and then seeing this bit of familiarity, the handful of regulars from the other pub rushed to the bar, almost eagerly to greet them, perhaps showing how uncomfortable we can be when that habitus is disturbed by an external force. Will the welcome be as mundane, as comfortable, as safe in this slightly different field? Got other things I can say, but I do realise we need to move on. So a couple of final thoughts, more about what I'd like to happen next, I suppose. I suppose the main thing I wanted to share was this social complexity that something like habitus and indeed the public sphere can help to make sense of. I've been increasingly frustrated with calls for ever more narrow research foci from employers and from external stakeholders at universities. And I think it's really important that we need to make sense of social phenomena by recognizing the complexity, not over-focusing on narrow conceptual frameworks and research questions. And that's why I think that some of these sociological ideas have been particularly helpful to me. Whether or not other people would say the same about it, it certainly helped me to focus my attention. So I'd say that viewing the pubs and their customers and the volunteering organisation and the voluntourists, the volunteer tourists, from a habitual habitus lens, we're encouraged to question what they are in those social environments, and question the nature of being a customer, an employee, a volunteer, and how the dispositions that we have in those different roles can be demonstrated by our behaviour and also by our internalisation of socio-cultural norms. So concepts like learning through doing, being socialised in both arenas, and behavioural regularity and affective loyalty were also discussed by these participants in both studies, either explicitly or implicitly. And this almost always came back to a perceived traditional community socialization of the past that is declining or seems to be declining in the present, and a concern for that, and a questioning from these participants of how future generations will learn to will learn the feel for the game as well as the rules for the game. Okay, I think I've gone a little bit over, but I'd like to give some time for some.
No, thank you very much, Peter. Just before we go to Q&A, and I'd encourage you to post questions in the chat, or just think about getting ready to ask questions, or contribute to the discussion. Really, we might have comments. But first of all, I'd like to hand over to Catherine Venter, who's going to provide her reflections and response on Peter's presentation.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. Thank you, Peter. I really enjoyed that very much. And I think it's often, and I was going to say always, but that seems a bit too overstating the case, but I think it's a very good thing to be looking at bringing different fields together because of the kinds of questions that it raises. And interesting that you ask whether it's then just becoming something that is overcomplicating a situation and they should be explored separately. And I think my initial reflection is I think there are aspects of both, because of course they are very, very different things. And I know here you're talking about a specific form of volunteering and you're talking about the volunteer tourism. And I was thinking about various other forms of volunteering, and so much of my work's been in health and social care organisations, and I could still see lots of resonance with the kinds of things that you were saying. But I also think that when we start talking about volunteers, there's a danger that we put too much in the pot, in that volunteers are very different things. So again, I keep having to remind myself that you're talking about a specific form of volunteering, but I still think that there are, you're in the process of bringing two areas together. It then raises those questions about how that can be extended and generalised to volunteering more broadly. So I think within the volunteering literature, there's been so much emphasis on the individual, and although of course it's increasingly recognised and acknowledged the way in which what individuals do in those contexts and their motivations and their access, nevertheless that social context is acknowledged as being important, but I'm not sure that it is always or often, whilst acknowledged, it still is not then considered that socially embedded and those deeper social relationships which are so important to the volunteering. So my feeling is it's really good to look at bringing these things together, but I think it does make us ask about what are we talking about when we're talking about volunteering. And I think a lot of that literature continues to focus on those kinds of motivations and the access to, and you mentioned about John Dean and the way in which people may not be socialized into the awareness of volunteering, and that linking also to the encouragement of people to volunteer further. And I think this gives another illustration of the ways in which volunteering varies. And one of the interesting pieces of work, I think, related to this is Kellerman and Mangan's work around, they do a typology of volunteering, and amongst those things, so there's the kind of instrumental sorts of approaches that we talked about, which is still very much about individual choice and agency, and that clearly needs to be set in a wider social context. But they also talk about the idea of voluntolding, when people are told to volunteer for different reasons. And this relates, I think, to your point about some of that formalisation processes that are going on with volunteering. And you talked about people volunteering within education, and you talked about in relation to CV building and that corporate social responsibility. And I think there's some really fine lines there in terms of when you're moving to this voluntolding. So Mangan and Kellerman talk about the corporate social responsibility, where people don't have choices necessarily about what it is they're volunteering for, and you're starting to remove that choice, which has been used as part of the kind of definition that that altruism and giving benefit, but to things that people have been passionate about themselves. And here that's increasingly a question of, is this something that I have to do? And you were talking about the socialization into that as something that there's an expectation, which again perhaps changes what we're talking about in terms of volunteering. And this links, I think, as well to one of the other areas I thought was really interesting around the affective and emotional attachment to, whether that's to institutions or to places or to groups of people, whether those are the people consuming the service or delivering it. And I think that attachment is really, really important. And again, that varies within those different groups of people. So I suppose thinking about the habitus and fields, one of my queries would be about, I think it's quite difficult to identify what the fields are that we're talking about in relation to volunteering. So I've found that very interesting as I was thinking about through those things. I think there's so much involved there, but actually that emphasises the importance of us better understanding the ways in which these are socially embedded. There's always this danger that we come back to the motivations and how individuals feel about what they're doing, but those wider social relationships seem to me crucial. And again, the blurring of lines, the only ways that we can look at those contours and boundaries, and you were talking about the kind of breaking of rules and maintaining of rules, but understanding those social relationships that are informing the volunteers' understanding of what it is they are doing in those settings seems to me very important. And to illustrate the point I'm making there, I've been looking at the involvement of volunteers in bodywork labour, which is an area of work where most of the organisations involved will say categorically, well, volunteers are not involved in bodywork labour. That wouldn't be right. That's what paid staff do. And yet when you actually explore what goes on, they inevitably are. And part of the reason in these health and social care organisations that they were involved was because their understanding of what they were doing. And they would talk, I noticed in some of your discussion, you were talking about being authentic. So they would talk about their being authentic was, if I care about somebody, then if they say they need to go to the toilet, I'm going to take them to the toilet and assist them. I can't just leave them. So being able to be who they felt they were in those environments required them to do things that might not fit the rules, and that they would step outside of those rules. But they used, and I guess it here, Habitus could be useful in this, they often were talking about the roles they'd undertaken in terms of caring for a parent. If that was my mum, this is what I would want to happen. And they talked about that as continuing care roles that they did elsewhere. I used to do this for my parents and I now do it here. And that enabled them, they also used that to step outside of rules, to say, well, actually, I'm not going to abide by the limitations of organisational rules, because in this instance, I've decided I'm not even a volunteer, I'm there for something else. But understanding the wider social relationships that explain how they understand what they're doing and how they navigate the roles, I think helps in trying to think about how those boundaries are seen. And of course, there's lots of work done about how those boundaries are kind of erected in the first place and maintained, and also where they dissolve. And I think, you know, Habitus can assist in, especially I think, in some of that dissolving of those. So I like your idea of the partial roles that they fulfill, but I think we need to develop the understanding of why and how they are moving between those. And I think that that is quite varied. And I'm bringing this to a kind of final point, really, about, you were talking about those wider changes, and you talked about the government roles and encouragement, and you talked about formalisation of some of these roles, and that being a general trend. And I think some of those overriding trends within the changes are really important to both what people are doing within the roles, how they understand them, and also how they draw on different fields and different sets of social relationships in order to understand those experiences. And central to one of those, I think, is that the whole professionalisation agenda, because within that, there's a lot, it inevitably becomes a lot of work in establishing apparent boundaries that then call into question. So people are then having to think differently about how they engage in that as a result of that. And for me, very often the tension comes back, or the issue comes back to the tension of between the meeting the demands of funders and the professionalisation agenda, and what organisations have to demonstrate in order to meet those demands as well as measure, and meeting the social mission of the organisation, which is very often the bit that the volunteers in particular are attached to. They are much less concerned about the funding environment and measurement and impact, other than to ensure the kind of continuity of that organisation, depending on where their attachment is. And I think that sets up real tensions in where those boundaries are set, and in what groups of social relationships are drawn on in order to make sense of what they're doing and how they're preparing to act. So to conclude, I think it's really useful to start thinking in these ways about very different areas, and I think there certainly are resonances. But I also feel volunteering encapsulates so many very different things. We have to think about how we situate those. But I've very much enjoyed it, and I feel like I've yes, I've noted down all sorts of things that I'd be interested to follow up in, things about the public space. And anyway, but yes, I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I just say one very quick thing?
I can't get my mic.
So can I just say one very quick thing?
Sorry, my mic. I couldn't get my microphone to turn back on. Yes, please do.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Catherine. It's really encouraging and very positive. But the one thing that I would say, because it can, and my mind shifts backwards and forwards on this, seem problematic. This idea of the formalisation of, particularly in this case, volunteer recruitment, whatever you want to call it. But I think partly that depends on how it's done. I think that's one of the problems. I did have a note to say this, but I was running out of time. One of the key things about this volunteer tourism, as you say, there's so many different types of volunteering, that this one was seen as interesting to me because I come from a tourism background, but also because of what they were doing. It was easier to do ethnography because you've got an evening and to talk to people, and that was a really big deal. Getting people to talk about the volunteering on the day projects was almost impossible. But it's seen by many as being a sort of introduction to volunteering for people that wouldn't normally do it. International students, local students, people that just wanted a weekend in the country, and that it's still a formalized approach to introducing people to volunteering. But rather than saying, do this and you'll get a tick on your CV, or do this and it'll do this or whatever, it sounds attractive. I'm not sure if it really works, but it sounds really attractive as something to follow up. And it gives, if you're away for a weekend or a week, then there's more of a sort of socialization opportunity than if you're going away for a day, you're being told a project, the rules, the health and safety, and being given a bit of training, you're doing it and going straight home. So that's part of the thinking behind these sort of volunteer and tourism projects. It's a bit of fun. It's not too hard, but you feel good about yourself when you've done it. So yeah, but I absolutely agree that it's a messy thing, volunteering. There's so many different approaches and ideas of it.
Thank you very much. Perhaps if we'd like to open up to wider questions and comments.
Anne-Marie,
Paul, yes?
you might just want to mention to people about how they can do it, given the problems.
Yeah. You can either, if you use the easiest way is to use the hands up function, which should be at the top bar of your. You should be able to see a little hand, then you can press the hand. If that's not working for you, then please do alert in the chat. I've got something. In which case I might, Paul, you have a question or a comment?
I just have a comment. So I suppose, Peter, I'm very familiar with Catherine's work, and I'm very familiar with your work. And I think in a sense, while you are talking about the same things, you're talking about different parts of the spectrum of volunteering. And I guess as a scholar of work and employment, I'd be interested to know about to what extent your participants in both ethnographies were interested in being employed, actually working there. I mean, to what extent did they feel as if this was something they would like to do, in a more formal way?
Wow, yeah. Again, this is one of those areas that I've been thinking a lot about. It didn't really come out today, but thinking about wanting to, being pushed into it. When I was doing the second phase in the UK in the pub study, two of the people, one of whom I knew from the previous study, who were retirees, were called back to work in the pubs behind the bar, and neither of them wanted to do it. And so they are actually customers who had a real close link and a great engagement with those particular pubs, started work there almost against their will because there was no one else to do it, and if they didn't, the place would close down, that sort of thing. Plenty of people volunteer in the pubs and do work without being paid, and will organise things, as I'm sure you're all familiar with. There's one couple who, again, both retired. The husband had worked as the manager of the bar when they couldn't find a manager, and his wife would run the pub quiz every week as a volunteer. So you've got all sorts of blurring going on there. As far as the volunteers, a lot of organisations, including EPV, see the best volunteers as potential employees. So they do tend to try to recruit through volunteers as well. And some will start the job with the explicit plan of seeking employment with the organisation. Some fall into it more by accident, but they see the appeal of it. I'm going to volunteer. It would be great to get a bit of work experience and a bit of money at the same time. So yeah, there is a lot of moving between roles for people. The state manager, when I was doing the research, he's since left, but the state manager started as a volunteer. So, and there's a lot of it. It tends to happen more from the volunteering, the day job, the day regular projects, than the volunteer tourism. But yeah, certainly it's a strategy for recruitment. It's not just accidental.
This is a very interesting idea to me. I'm going to abuse the chair a little bit because, given I can't see any other burning questions at the moment. This idea, I can't quite work it out, Paul, whether or not, because I think there is some element of discourse within the sector that, and actually more widely, that if you're doing something unpaid, it's lesser somehow, you know, and that the ideal is to be paid for what you do, and there is some or that, you know, you can't be held to account to the higher standards, or you can't be accountable, you can't be responsible, and therefore most organisations, if they had a choice, would have paid employees rather than volunteers, and they're somehow forced into using volunteers because they don't have any money. And there's an element of that in what Catherine was saying in regard to very split duties between what volunteers are allowed to do and what paid staff are allowed to do formally. Now, the thing is that I'm always really cross about that, both in terms of my own volunteering experiences and what I do outside of my paid work, but also with regard to the research that Jenna Ward and I have been carrying out in the National Trust, where it absolutely relies on thousands and thousands and thousands of volunteers to do things. And while there is some things at the margins, there really isn't any idea that those volunteers are paid employees or are ever going to be, nor are a replacement for paid staff. And that actually the whole discourse is that the nature of volunteering gives you something qualitatively and significantly different in terms of the quality of interaction that you get, the kind of service that you might get, the passion, commitment, etc. It is blurry, so I'm simplifying things, but so that's the first bit of that. The second bit is obviously my work has been very much involved around the management of volunteers, and it's predicated on a view that working as a volunteer is very different to working as a paid employee, and therefore requires a different kind of management process, style, interaction, whatever. And that actually getting underneath that has been really kind of important for us, that kind of black box of what it means to interact with a paid member of staff who's trying to manage a large group of volunteers. So I think there are those two things, but it is predicated on this thing that for me it's qualitatively different being a volunteer.
I wonder how far that is about the nature of the organisation as well, because the EPV, being a volunteer organisation. It's there for the volunteers, and it sees them in lots of different ways, including almost as customers. And so they have quite a high position in the pecking order, and they're valued in a different way, perhaps. I'm not saying it's always smooth and glorious, but there's you never quite know. One of the things, I'm playing with a paper at the moment, one of the things that I'm trying to get my head around is this idea that if you have an expert volunteer who is far more knowledgeable about what you're doing than the team leader, because the team leaders often are it's a low paid job, and they're often either younger people, like I said, who've just been recruited from the ranks of volunteers and perhaps are studying or have studied ecology or something. But they can often be in awe of some of the volunteers. There was an animal behaviourist that came along to a couple of projects, and he was brilliant. And we had bird specialists coming, and we had we didn't normally, on the volunteer tourism projects, we didn't normally have under 18 because of various child protection regulations and they had separate things for children, but he was allowed on special dispensation to come with his grandmother, and he knew more about insects than anyone, and so you've got that grouping of potentially very specialist people and people that have never done it before. You don't know who's going to be there, because they don't, it's not like a regular volunteer group that they have for the day projects. You just don't know who's going to be there. It's fascinating to see how a group can evolve in such a short period of time, and different roles and so forth evolve.
Yes, thank you. I see, Catherine, that you've got your hand up. Just 1 second. Sally, I'm going to do this. You put a comment in with regard to citizens' advice, and I don't know if you would feel able to, you don't have to, but it's just interesting to know your reflections on just that bit of that conversation, actually, about that mixture between paid, unpaid, who does what, whether one's seen as more valuable than the other.
Yeah, I think citizens' advice is a really good example of an organisation that's completely structured around the use of volunteers, and so there is a little bit of overlap between paid work and people volunteering, but you don't, the organisation is so reliant on the volunteers that you certainly don't get a sense that I'm speaking as a volunteer here, you don't feel as though you're an inferior part of the organisation. But I think volunteering at Citizens' Advice is perhaps quite an unusual situation, because people train for a very long time. The organisation expects quite a big commitment from its volunteers over a certain amount of time a week, but also in terms of the hope is that you won't just do the training and then run off and do something else. So perhaps it's an unusual sort of volunteering.
Yeah, thank you. Catherine.
So I think this very much follows on, but I was going to say, so across, I think that point Peter was saying there about how it depends on the organisation, I think that's probably very important. So some organisations, and again it would be questionable about what those reasons are, but may feel that they are more highly regulated, or they're involved in very particular ways and therefore use volunteers differently. And in terms of, or try and make very clear demarcation between what volunteers do and what a paid member of staff does. But even in those organisations and in other organisations, certainly there was loads of cases where they would talk about things that volunteers could do precisely because they were volunteers that a paid member of staff couldn't do, so that a person who was liaising them would know that they were there with them, would know that they were there because they had chosen to be. They weren't there because they were being paid to be, and that made a real difference to the kinds of things that they felt volunteers could do. But I think, again, so some of the aspects around that professionalisation came back to, so Anne-Marie was talking about the difficulties, well actually, and Peter, you were saying about the difficulties in managing when these volunteers who may be hugely experienced, and you talked about some kind of expert knowledge, but the other kind of expert knowledge that many of the volunteers often have is because they have been with an organisation for years and years and years and years. And generally are there a vast amount of many years longer than many of the paid staff, and that again creates whole sets of challenges around the management of it. And I can remember people talking to me about sort of seeing their job almost to be the kind of the stone in the shoe or the thorn in the side of people who were there as managers, because they knew what it was really about. And that's really difficult and problematic as well. So I think there's a whole series of both kind of institutional issues at the heart of that makes it really, really interesting.
A little bit like customers in a pub and the way they treat management.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think for us, the way that we can, and I mean, I haven't looked at Habitus, and I can see, given the place and space, it just makes so much sense, and I need to. But we've certainly looked at it in terms of affect. The affective commitment of volunteers, very, very high levels of affective commitment. I mean, levels of affective commitment that in a private organisation or commercial paid employment context, that's what managers are searching for. It's the holy grail of getting that people to do more than they need to do because they want to, you know. But that's incredible when you're in those contexts where you've got a volunteer who, one is been there a long time, highly skills and experience, and also has a massive passion for the place, space, cause, whatever it is. That's a tough management challenge, and particularly, as you say, tough if what you are is quite a junior, lowly paid member of staff. Yeah, it's like, I mean, and that problem, which the National Trust definitely faces, appears to be faced by many organisations that rely on volunteers in one way or another.
And on a daily basis, that can be made even more tricky if you've got someone that's never been there before and you've got 7 people that know what they're doing, and the leader, a 20-something, just out of uni, first couple of weeks work in any sort of job, has to give a health and safety and talk and risk assessment every single day when they start. That's where it gets it can be quite uncomfortable. In this particular instance, the leaders that I observed, they all knew what they were doing. They'd been there, they'd seen it because they were all volunteers before. So it wasn't quite so problematic, but I could imagine it could be very, very difficult to cope with. Can you say as well, Paul mentioned something about doing unpaid work in film and TV. I'd perhaps add to that in the chat that one group of people that I didn't see that often, but I did do some day projects in Australia. There's a scheme called Work for the Dole. I don't know if you're familiar with this, and this is essentially paid voluntary work, because they don't get their dole if they don't do the volunteering, and that makes it that those are some of the more difficult people for the leaders to deal with. On that note, I believe that the Conservative government is trying to introduce something like that, are they? Or have they done it already? For Work for the Dole?
I can't. Anne-Marie, can't hear you.
Doing any kind of search that work or activity that takes you away from your job search might mean that you don't get your benefits. So actually it's quite difficult to do voluntary work or any kind of training that's not established on one of the schemes. It's a bit problematic. Catherine, did you have a legacy hand? Was that? Yeah, that's fine. Paul.
So I was just going to pick up on this idea as work for the dole, because there is this sort of general workfare as opposed to welfare narrative, which Anne-Marie's just explained, that the particular workfare model that is in the UK, which I think is also in Ireland certainly, and North America, which is essentially you have to work to get your benefits, but you work by being active in the labour market, job seeking. So you've got to sort of demonstrate that you effectively put in a full day's work, Monday to Friday, or whatever, job seeking. So in a sense, what you're then suggesting, because I remember the Tories during the Thatcher era talked about this idea of well, you know, we can't have the indolent poor just sitting around at home receiving their benefits. We need to put them to work painting stones white, sweeping up streets, clearing canals or whatever, you know. So and that very much harks, is it not, to the old pre-poor law system, the Speen-Hamlin system, for those of you that know your English history, where essentially, you know, if you were going to be looked after by society, then you had to give something back in that way. So maybe, I don't know, it's an interesting angle to look at the narrative in the Australian context. Just an observation, really.
Yeah.
There's no one else. I'll step in because I think there's so many questions and comments. I'll have Peter. I was just thinking about this idea of habitus, and it might actually, if Louisa is still on here, might relate to the work that Louisa is doing in trying to work out what kind of appetite there is within communities for volunteering activity. And the idea that you had that in particular communities, volunteering per se wasn't part of their habitus. It wasn't part of an expectation of what they would do. And so is there something about, if we want to encourage volunteering, then we have to understand that wider habitus. We have to understand what the meaning or what stigma or what it might have to do something unpaid.
I don't think it's necessarily about a stigma as such. It was simply something that people didn't do. And this is where the if you like, the embodied nature, if you like, of habitus. And again, if Bourdieu is saying that, he's not saying it's a sort of mechanistic determinism, he's saying it's setting constraints and limits, sort of, but you can operate within those. And to be realistic, you know, every now and again, those limits and constraints are going to be broken, and it might be by the individual, it might be through a situation like COVID, for example, you know. But yeah, I think that this is where it's difficult, because if you're trying to introduce formal systems, then that's probably not going to have the sort of impact that you want. It's going to be one of those practices where you've got a danger of unintended consequences. If people see encouraged to see volunteering by universities, by employers, and by governments as being good for their future, for their employability, for this, that, and the other, then it's not really volunteering anymore. And if it's got means to an end, does that mean that it's a time constrained thing that we will do and then we'll stop doing? So you're still not getting that it's what we do. It's what we do until we get what we want.
Do you think as well that might be, and then back to Catherine's original reflection, was that, does it depend on the type of the activity? The only reason I say this is that, I mean, you know, if I think one of my areas of volunteering that I do is in community theatre, which, and then the theatre sector is very white, middle class. And so there's this whole, like, you know, soul searching in terms of trying to engage with a wider diversity of people. And why is it that certain communities don't see community theatre as something that's worth volunteering for? And this idea that there are some activities that are viewed as being, you would. So we've in particular had this conversation at Coventry Council recently about the South Asian community within Coventry. And that volunteering does occur at temples and at a whole number of other places, the Fosal Community Centre, for example. But certain areas of activity are deemed not to be things that you volunteer for. And I was thinking as well that if you talked about some of these working class communities, and I'm probably talking in stereotypes here, but you probably find there are volunteering activities, yes. Reffing at Sunday football teams, or doing that kind of stuff. It's just the nature of the activity.
They don't call it volunteering. They don't see it as volunteering. And that's I mean, I think everyone does that. We do stuff that is volunteering that we don't perceive as volunteering. And that example of the community theatre, I keep in touch with the UK by listening to BBC podcasts. And I was listening to one. They sort of blur into one a little bit, but what you said there just resonated. There was a youngish black actor, professional actor, and he was just talking about his experience. And he did community theatre, but no one did community theatre. No one from his background did it. And listening to him talking about how he sort of fell into it by accident because a teacher at school suggested it and it changed his life. It shows that the constraints aren't absolute, but at the same time they're pretty powerful. Because the joke about Bourdieu was always that he used to complain, didn't he, that the English never understood him because they never read in French, which is fair enough. But that the person that made good in French hierarchical society claimed that it was not possible to make good in French hierarchical society, which I think is a nice little thing. I don't know, something idea.
Yeah, thank you. I'm realizing that we're for the end of our time. It's 11:30 our time, so I guess 9:30 your time. Are there any burning questions left? Paul, do you want to say something?
I think it might be nice for you, Anne-Marie, to tell us about the next seminar on the 13th of January.
Now you put me on the spot. What is it?
It's you.
Oh, is it? I'm actually thinking, as I was going on about this, is that I'm hoping, right, so 13th of January will be on if my colleague Annabelle is back at work. So I've been doing this work with the National Trust for some considerable time now, and some of you will have heard various versions of it. Jenna and I, and we had this with regard to what I was talking about with managing difficult volunteers. I'm being very simplistic here. We've developed a toolkit working with emotions in volunteering, and which has been piloted by the National Trust, and so Annabelle, who is the Director of Community Participation and Volunteering at the National Trust, and myself will hopefully be presenting a joint presentation on that toolkit and its possible implications in the sector. I'm going to have to go off and look at Habitus now to see if this is going to be something I can add into my theoretical framing, but yeah, so all being well, I'll be doing it if Annabelle isn't. So, but it'll be really nice to have that link with, with my practitioner co-researcher. That would be really nice to be doing that.
And Peter, you'll be very welcome, although I'm afraid you'll have to stay up late for this, because it's going to be 4 hours later, 2 o'clock GMT.
Well. Oh yeah, it'll be after, won't it?
Or you can watch the recording.
That's a good idea.
Well, all that's left to say is thank you so much for I found it so immensely interesting and stimulating discussion, and it was also just really nice to hear about a research process as well, and looking at a range of different projects that you were trying to bring together in a theoretical framing. And thank you for sharing your stream of consciousness ideas with us. It didn't come across as a stream of consciousness, so you needn't have worried. And yeah, just thank you very much from all of us here at Leicester and at CSWEF.